Hello everyone! Today we are going to learn about whether Satan is truly evil or not. Let's get started. Firstly, we will start with the origins and identity of Satan. The figure known today as Satan did not emerge fully formed as the horned, red-skinned violent familiar in modern iconography. Instead, his identity evolved slowly across centuries, rooted in ancient religious texts where his role was more subtle and ambiguous. In the Hebrew Bible's earliest writing, Satan was not yet the prince of darkness, but rather a title, his Satan, meaning the accuser or the adversary. In the book of Job, Satan functioned within the divine court, acting as a kind of celestial prosecutor permitted by God to test the righteousness of Job. Far from being a road agent, he appears as part of God's heavenly council, challenging human virtue to reveal true faith. In Zechariah, he again appears in a judicial role, standing at the right hand of the high priest Joshua to accuse him. These early references do not present Satan as evil in the metaphysical sense, but as a necessary figure within the divine system of justice. Even in Genesis, where the serpent tempts Eve in the Garden of Eden, the text does not explicitly identify this being as Satan. The association of the serpent with Satan was a later theological development, primarily shaped by post-exilic Jewish thought and further elaborated in early Christianity. Therefore, in the beginning, Satan was more of a tester than a tempter, an agent of divine will rather than a rebel opposed to it. As Judaism evolved and began to absorb influences from surrounding cultures, especially during and after the Babylonian exile, the conception of evil became more dualistic and Satan's role began to shift. Apocryphal texts like the Book of Enoch began to flesh out a celestial rebellion narrative where angels led by figures like Azazel or Sanzazel defied God and descended to earth. These stories contributed to a growing notion of demonic corruption and spiritual warfare. By the Second Temple burial, Satan was not longer merely an agent of testing, but a potential source of corruption, chaos, and deceit. This theological transition laid the groundwork for the fully developed Satan of the New Testament, where he emerged as the cosmic antagonist to God and Christ. In the Gospels, Satan directly tempted Jesus in the wilderness, offering him worldly power in exchange for worship. Here, he is described as the ruler of this world and the source of lies, sin, and death. His identity merged with other marvelous figures such as Beelzebub or the devil, and he becomes increasingly personified as a singular being responsible for orchestrating rebellion against God. The book of Revelation portrays him as the great dragon, the deceiver of nations, who is cut out of heaven after a celestial world. This vision of Satan as a fallen angelic being, cast out for pride and rebellion, became the dominant image in Christian tradition and inspired a deepening dualism in theology. God represents perfect good and Satan represents ultimate evil. In Islamic tradition, the character analogous to Satan is Iblis, a jinn made of smokeless fire who was condemned after refusing to bow to Adam when God commanded it. This narrative, found in multiple chapters of the Quran, reflects a distant theological framework. Unlike in Christianity, where Satan is often seen as a fallen angel, Islam makes it clear that angels are sinless and always obedient to God. Iblis, being of the jinn, beings with free will, was capable of disobedience. His sin was pride, for he considered himself superior to Adam and could not accept a command that, in his view, violated his sense of divine hierarchy. God curses Iblis and cast him out, but not before Iblis asked for time until the day of judgment to tempt humanity and prove their unworthiness. God grants him this request, therefore establishing Iblis not merely as an enemy of humankind, but as a threat within God's larger plan. Like the Christian Satan, Iblis is deceptive and manipulative, whispering evil into the hearts of people. However, his power is limited. He can only tempt, not force. Ultimately, Islam emphasized personal responsibility and divine mercy, teaching that no soul is led astray except by its own choice. While Iblis is cursed, his existence plays a functional role within the moral architecture of the universe. Even in his rebellion, he served to distinguish the righteous from the wicked, echoing early roles of Satan as a tester rather than an autonomous embodiment of evil. When examined across these Abrahamic traditions, the origin and identity of Satan reveal a far more nuanced figure than the monolithic villain he later became in popular imagination. Rather than a singular being of absolute evil, Satan has historically functioned as a moral counterpoint, an accuser, a repeller, a tester, and a deceiver. Each aspect reflecting the theological and philosophical needs of the time. In Judaism, he originated as a being under God's control, participating in divine governance. In Christianity, he morphed into a fallen angel, a being who resisted God and seeks to lead others into destruction. Yet, even this narrative reflects complex questions about freedom, temptation, and the nature of sin. In Islam, he embodies the tension between pride and submission, arrogance and humility, but his role as tempter is still part of the divine design. Each version reflects not only a theological stand but also a moral framework about the nature of evil, the role of choice, and the reality of spiritual struggle. Far from being a one-dimensional figure, Satan emerged as a dynamic symbol of humanity's confrontation with its own wickedness and the sequences of rebellion and the evil present tension between moral clarity and moral failure. The question of whether Satan is truly evil cannot be separated from the evolving narrative that defines his purpose. Is he a destroyer or a divine instrument that reveals who we are? This deeper view of Satan's origin opens the door to profound reflection on the state, morality, and the mysterious balance between divine will and personal responsibility. The question of whether Satan is truly evil cannot be answered without diving to the complex theological frameworks that shape how we understand good, evil, justice, and divine purpose. In many religious systems, evil is often seen not as an independent force, but as a distortion of good, a deviation from the divine order. Saint Augustine of Hippo famously exerted that evil has no substance of its own. It is the absence of good, a corruption of something originally created good. Applied to Satan, This raises a challenging theological dilemma. If Satan was originally created by God, and all that God created was declared good, then Satan's evil nature must be a corruption of an originally good being. This idea supports the notion that Satan's evil is not inherent or internal but emergent, an act of will, of rebellion, of a choice to turn away from the divine. This view places great emphasis on the freedom of the will, a gift from God that allows both angels and humans to choose righteousness or rebellion. From this perspective, Satan's evil is tragic rather than essential, and his actions become a mirror of the same dangers that face any sentient creature with free will. This concept is further complicated by the existence of evil within a divinely governed universe. If God is all-powerful and all-good, why allow Satan to exist and continue his operations across millennia? Theodicy, the defense of divine justice, is the presence of evil, struggles to reconcile the suffering caused by Satan with the nature of a loving and omnipotent creator. Some theological interpretations suggest that Satan, even in his rebellion, served a hidden purpose within God's providence. His temptation tests the faith and resolve of humanity, revealing sincerity from hypocrisy and drawing a clear line between good and evil. Without the presence of evil, there could be no true choice, no moral development, no spiritual growth. In this light, Satan becomes not a road enemy to God, but a necessary adversary in a human moral journey, a negative space that defies the cultures of virtue. This echoes the idea seen in both Jewish and Islamic work, where Satan remains under God's sovereignty, not operating independently but within the limits set by the divine will. If Satan's existence contributes to the greater good by refining the soul and testing the righteous, can he be labeled wholly evil, or is his function simply unpleasant but necessary? Philosophers have also worked in on this dilemma. In classical theology, especially medieval scholasticism, thinkers like Thomas argued that angels and thus Satan possess intellect and will but do not operate under the same constraints as humans. Once an angel chooses, that choice is internal fixed because they make it with full knowledge and clarity. Therefore, Satan's fall was not a result of ignorance or momentary passion, but of a deliberate and irrevocable rejection of God. From this view, his evil is profound, not because he was missed, but because he fully understood the gravity of his rebellion and still embraced it. Yet, even Aquinas acknowledged that Satan's continued existence fits into the divine order. His presence permits the working out of justice, the exposure of evil, and the glorification of good. Through contrast, modern philosophical thought, particularly within existentialism and postmodernism, has interrogated Satan not merely as being, but as a symbol, the rebel, the outsider, the one who questions authority. In some interpretations, Satan is the archetype of autonomy, challenging imposed order and exerting independent identity. While such a view often romanticizes Satan, especially in literature, it complicates the traditional binary of good and evil. Can rebellion be noble if the system being rebelled against is unjust? In religious tradition, the answer is no. God is God by definition, but in philosophical terms, this question continues to provoke debate. Furthermore, mystics and esoteric traditions have offered alternative readings of Satan's nature. In some strands of Gnostic thoughts, the material world itself is seen as a prison, and the Creator God, often associated with the Old Testament, is a false or malevolent demiurge. In this system, the serpent in Eden is not evil, but a liberator, granting humanity the knowledge to transcend their ignorance. This inversion of the traditional narrative recasts Satan as a misunderstood figure, a bearer of enlightenment rather than deception. While this view is considered heretical by mainstream Christianity, it reflects the diversity of thought regarding the adversary's role. Even within Christian mysticism, figures such as Jacob or William question the moral categories applied to Satan. Plague famously wrote, "The reason Milton wrote in fetters when he wrote of angels and gods, and at liberty when of evils and health, is because he was a true poet and of the devil party without knowing it." Such expressions highlight the enduring tension between authority and autonomy, obedience and rebellion. These perspectives do not deny Satan's opposition to divine order, but suggest that the qualities associated with him, freedom, intellect, questioning, are not evil in themselves, but dangerous when divorced from divine wisdom. Throughout human history, the figure of Satan has transcended theology and entered deeply into culture, art, literature, and collective imagination, involving far beyond his scriptural origins. In many ways, the cultural interpretation of Satan has reflected the changing fears, values, and struggles of societies. During the early Christian century, Satan was primarily viewed through the lens of sin and temptation, a subtly presence lurking behind idolatry, heresy, and moral decay. However, as the church grew in power and influence during the Middle Age, the image of Satan became increasingly vivid and theatrical, often viewed as a political and psychological tool. The Inquisition and the witch hunt used the idea of Satan as a rude, malevolent force seducing people into rebellion against God and church authority. Artists depicted him with horns, cloven hooves, bat wings, and grotesque figures, an amalgam of ancient pagan gods and monsters designed to terrify and want. Satan was no longer thus a theological adversary, but a scapegoat for social unrest, disease, famine, and dissent. His cultural image was molded to serve institutional needs, reinforcing obedience and casting enemies of the established order as Satan's agents, whether they were women accused of witchcraft or reformers challenging clerical corruption. The Renaissance and Enlightenment periods introduced a profound shift in how Satan was portrayed culturally. As humanism flourished and philosophical inquiry deepened, Satan began to appear not merely as the evil destroyer, but as a tragic and complex character. In John Milton's Paradise Lost, Satan is not a cartoonist villain, but a proud, eloquent figure who famously declares better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. Milton does not deny Satan's evil, but his Satan possesses death, internal conflict, and defiant charisma. This portrayal resonated with later readers who saw in Satan a symbol of resistance against tyranny, whether divine or earthly. During the Romantic era, poets such as Lord Byron or Percy embraced Satan as an emblem of individualism, rebellion, and passionate struggle against unjust systems. The Satan of control became a mirror for humanity's own yearning for freedom, knowledge, and self-definition, even when such pursuits came at great cost. While theologians continue to denounce Satan as the father of lies and destruction, artists and thinkers increasingly explore the emotional or psychological dimensions of his fall. Was it ambition that damned him, or the courage to question the absolute? In this reimagining, Satan represented both the danger and the necessity of questioning authority. In more modern times, Satan has become an even more motivated control figure, moving through literature, film, music, and subcultures with both sinister and symbolic resonance. Horror films often depict Satan as a supernatural force of evil, seeking possession or apocalypse, while other genres explore his role as a tempter, trickster, or deal-maker, offering power in exchange for souls. From Faustian legends to contemporary thrillers like The Exorcist or The Devil's Advocate, Satan remains a compelling antagonist because he exposes human weakness, pride, and desire. But not all portrayals are wholly negative. In some music types, particularly heavy metal, black metal, or even hip-hop, Satan is invoked not as a literal being, but as a symbol of defiance, rebellion, and personal empowerment. These expressions are often misunderstood as promoting evil. In truth, many are critics of societal norms, religious hypocrisy, or authoritarian control. Artists use Satan to challenge the system that repress individuality or deny uncomfortable truth. In satire and pop culture, Satan sometimes even appears in humorous or ironic forms, as seen in shows like South Park or Lucifer, where he is given emotional depth, personal struggles, or even redemptive qualities. Such portrayals may not reflect theological accuracy, but they show how deeply the image of Satan has been absorbed, reimagined, and transformed by controlness and artistic curiosity. Across different cultures and regions, the image of Satan adapts to local mythologies, fears, and ideologies. In some parts of Latin America, Diablo appears as a figure in folk tales, tricking or testing villagers. In African Christian contexts, Satan may be associated with witchcraft, generational curses, or spiritual warfare, often blending traditional belief with biblical teachings. In Western occultism and some strands of neo-paganism, Satan or similar figures may be reinterpreted as archetypes of inner power, shadow work, or liberation from dogma. The Church of Satan, founded by Anton LaVey in 1966, does not worship Satan as a deity, but embraces him as a symbol of human nature, carnal instinct, and rational egoism. This simplistic reinterpretation marks a radical departure from traditional views, and while controversial, it illustrates how deeply the figure of Satan resonates as a canvas for human expression. Even in atheist or secular contexts, Satan endures, not because people believe him as a literal being, but because he embodies a perennial tension between order and chaos, conformity and independence, obedience and self-assertion. Whether feared, mocked, celebrated, and dissected, Satan remains one of the most enduring control symbols in human history, reflecting our darkest fears, our boldest question, and our ongoing struggle to understand the boundaries of good and evil. Next, we come to Satan in religious alternatives. Outside the Judeo-Christian framework, where Satan is often identified as the enemy of God and humanity, many religious alternatives interpret the adversary figure in vastly different ways, some even lacking a direct equivalent. In Judaism, for instance, the role of Satan is significantly more restrained and complex than the fully formed prince of evil, seen in later Christian theology. In the Hebrew Bible, has Satan, literally the accuser or the adversary, appears not as a being in rebellion against God, but as a member of the divine cult, tasked with testing the righteousness of human beings. The most famous example is found in the book of Job, where Satan challenges Job's piety, suggesting that his faithfulness is dependent on prosperity. God permits Satan to test Job not out of malevolence, but as a means to prove the depth of human integrity. The vision portrays Satan not as evil incarnate, but as a divine prosecutor, an agent of justice rather than a rebel. Such a figure is integral to divine order, not opposed to it. The Judaism later continued this tradition, with many scholars viewing Satan not as an independent force, but as a metaphor for the evil inclination within every person, a necessary counterpart to the good inclination that enables moral choice. In this light, Satan becomes a symbol of challenge and growth, not ultimate doom. In Islam, the figure closest to Satan is Iblis, who refused to bow to Adam and was cast out of God's favor. While Iblis shares similarity with the Christian devil, especially in his role as tempter, his theological function is subtly different. Iblis is not a fallen angel, since angels in Islam are seen as incapable of disobedience, but a jinn, a being created from smokeless fire, who possessed free will. His refusal to bow was rooted in pride, believing himself superior to Adam because of his origin. As punishment, Iblis is granted the ability to tempt humanity until the day of judgment, but his power is limited. He can suggest, whisper, and deceive, but not compel. The Bible repeatedly emphasized human responsibility and agency, stating that Satan has no authority over the faithful. Interestingly, Islamic theology preserves the notion that Iblis remains in dialogue with God and is ultimately part of the divine task of life, designed to separate the righteous from the wicked. In traditions, Iblis is sometimes interpreted with tragic or paradoxical complexity, seen not only as the proud rebel, but as one who paradoxically loved God so intensely that he refused to bow to anyone else. Though such interpretations are mystical and not mainstream, they reflect the wider Islamic approach. Satan is not the ruler of hell, nor an equal to God, but a being who chose arrogance over submission, still operating under divine decree. Eastern religions, such as Hinduism and Buddhism, do not contain a Satan figure in the same way, though analogous adversarial beings do appear in their cosmology. In Hinduism, beings such as Ravana, the demon king in the Ramayana, or Asuras are often in opposition to gods. But these conflicts are not framed as cosmic dualism. The Asuras, originally considered divine themselves, were later recast as being characterized by pride, ignorance, or desire for domination. They are not evil in an absolute sense, but caught in cycle of karma, driven by attachment and ego. Even beings like Ravana are portrayed with nuance, possessing intelligence, devotion, and greatness marked by unchecked arrogance. The Hindu worldview maintains that all beings, even the most misguided, are ultimately on a journey toward liberation. In Buddhism, the figure of Mara plays a role closest to Satan, a tempter who seeks to obstruct enlightenment. When the Buddha meditated under the Bodhi tree, Mara appeared with his daughters to seduce him, sent demons to terrify him, and tried to sow doubt in his heart. Yet Mara is not a being of internal damnation, but a personification of death, desire, and delusion, the internal forces that bind beings to samsara, the cycle of suffering. Therefore, in both traditions, the evil figure is not a rebel against a personal god, but a metaphysical force, or a being operating within cosmic law, serving as a task or a manifestation of ignorance. Other religious systems and esoteric traditions present even more radical reinterpretations of the satanic figure. In Gnostic Christianity, which emerged in the early century after Christ, the creator god of the material world is sometimes identified with the demiurge, a flawed, ignorant, or even malevolent being who traps soul in metal. In some texts, the serpent in Eden is reinterpreted as a liberator, offering the knowledge needed to escape the illusions of the material realm. In these narratives, Satan becomes a bearer of messages, a revealer of truth, and even a misunderstood redeemer. These views were condemned as heretical by the early church, but they illustrate how flexible the Satan figure can be in religious alternatives. Ultimately, the diversity of satanic interpretations across religious alternatives reveals something profound. Evil, rebellion, temptation, and spiritual struggle are not the inclusive domain of one religious narrative but universal themes. Whether embodied in Satan, Iblis, Mara, or Asuras, the adversary serves as a crucible through which spiritual resilience is forged. The stark dualism of Christianity, which casts Satan as the internal enemy of God and goodness, is the one expression among many. Other traditions often offer more integrative or cyclical, portraying adversarial figures not as irredeemable villains, but as necessary forces, embodiments of human frailty, or even to participants in cosmic reconciliation. These frameworks challenge the notion of absolute evil and invite us to see opposition not only as corruption, but as a mirror, a teacher, and a stepping stone on the path toward understanding. By examining Satan through the lens of religious alternatives, we do not dilute the seriousness of his symbolic power. Rather, we enrich it by seeing how different civilizations have wrestled with the darkness inside and outside the human soul. In the following part, we will talk about psychological and philosophical dimension. The figure of Satan is as much a psychological reality as he is a theological one. Beyond doctrines and scriptures, he presents a deeply embedded symbol within the architecture of human mind, an archetype of darkness, conflict, rebellion, and moral ambiguity that transcends cultural boundaries. In the realm of analytical psychology, particularly the works of Carl Jung. Satan is closely allied with the archetype of the shadow, the unconscious aspect of the personality which the conscious ego does not identify in itself. The shadow contains repressed weaknesses, instincts, desires, and shortcomings. While most people are taught to view themselves as fundamentally good or moral, the shadow is composed of everything that contradicts that self-image. Jung observed that individuals often project their shadows onto others, identifying what they dislike in themselves in the traits of people they come to fear or hate. Societies, too, project collective shadows, demonizing enemies, outsiders, or those who deviate from the norm. Satan, in this sense, functions as the ultimate repository of that projection. Everything we fear, despise, or refuse to confront within ourselves is cast onto this singular, externalized figure of evil. But Jung also emphasized that confronting and integrating the shadow is essential for personal growth. If Satan is the embodiment of all we reject, then facing Satan is psychologically akin to acknowledging and mastering our hidden impulses. Without this confrontation, the shadow gains power in the unconscious, influencing behavior from behind the senses. Therefore, Satan is not only a symbol of evil, but a necessary adversary for the journey to God's psychological wholeness, forcing us to come to terms with our own dualities, our capacity for both love and cruelty, creation and destruction, obedience and rebellion. In the realm of existential and moral philosophy, Satan serves as a complex symbol of autonomy, free will, and ethical confrontation with the cosmos. Philosophers explore themes that, while not directly invoking Satan, resonate with the spiritual defiance he represents. Philosophers' declaration that God is dead and his critical upheld morality challenged the foundation of traditional religious values and proposed that the individual must create their own meaning in an indifferent universe. The image of Satan, especially as portrayed in Milton's Paradise Lost, becomes emblematic of this existential defiance. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven echoes the same drive for self-definition that underlies rebellions. The concept of radical freedom posits that human beings are condemned to be free, that in the absence of an absolute moral authority, we must do our best and bear the responsibility for those choices. In this context, Satan can be seen as the archetype of moral agencies, untethered from divine decree, the one who dares to choose even at great cost. Camus' idea of the observer, where human beings search for meaning in a silent, indifferent universe, raises similar questions. Is rebellion against absurdity itself a kind of salvation? When Satan rebels, is he committing the ultimate evil, or is he expressing the ultimate existential freedom? Philosophically, Satan does not merely represent sin or temptation. He represents the moment one questions authority, confronts the absurdity of suffering, and demands answer from the divine. He is both the moral heretic and the tragic hero, damned not necessarily for weakness, but for daring to ask questions out of fear. From a Freudian psychoanalytic perspective, Satan embodies the repressed rights and instincts of the id, those primal urges related to aggression, sexuality, domination, and selfishness. Freud viewed religion as a societal mechanism for controlling these instincts, often at the expense of individual mental health. In his seminal work, *Civilization and its Discontents*, Freud argues that the suppression of instinctual desire imposed by the demands of civilization and internal life as the superego leads to guilt, neurosis, and internal conflict. Satan, from this lens, is the symbol of those unacknowledged desires that cannot be fully eradicated and thus emerge in distorted or destructive forms. The biblical narratives of Satan tempting humanity with forbidden knowledge or pleasure are metaphorical representations of this inner tension. The Garden of Eden, for example, becomes a parable about the awakening of consciousness, the conflict between instinct and law, freedom and control. The serpent whisper is the voice of the id, seductive, dangerous, but also necessary for development. Freudian analysis would argue that Satan is not a supernatural enemy, but a metaphor for the unavoidable reality of desire that realism often represses in the name of purity. This repression, if too rigid, can lead to pathological outcomes, including obsessive behavior, guilt complexes, and misplaced aggression. Conversely, a balanced psyche acknowledges these rights, channels them constructively, and understands their place within the broader human experience. From this point of view, Satan is a misunderstood archetype, not the enemy of humanity, but the embodiment of what humanity refuses to reconcile within itself. In more contemporary psychological and philosophical interpretation, Satan takes on the role of the necessary adversary, a figure that both tests and reveals the true nature of virtue. Thinkers such as Jordan or Rollo argue that the presence of evil, whether personified or abstract, is not merely a problem to be eliminated, but a challenge that demands a deeper engagement with meaning, courage, and responsibility. Peterson, drawing on Jungian and biblical archetypes, describes Satan as the archetype of chaos and destruction, but also the necessary contrast that gives rise to the hero's journey. Without Satan, there is no test of character, no catalyst of moral choice. Satan is the voice of doubt, the embodiment of chaos, the dragon that was the treasure in the mythic cave. The journey toward truth, wholeness, or salvation requires the individual to face this adversary not with hatred alone, but with insight, courage, and humility. Similarly, the notion of the Satan within reflects the idea that each person must grapple with internal temptation, pride, and the seduction of power. Philosophically, this aligns with the idea that morality is not simply a matter of obedience to external laws, but a conscious, often agonizing navigation of values in a complex and morally ambiguous world. In such a world, Satan is not merely a villain to be punished, but a teacher who reveals the limits of dogma, the illusion of perfection, and the necessity of authentic moral struggle. Evil, in this framework, is not always obvious or external. Sometimes it is born from fear, silence, or the failure to act. Therefore, Satan challenges not only belief, but complacency, compelling the soul to either rise in truth or be consumed by denial. So, what is Satan's role in divine justice and cosmic order? The figure of Satan plays an indispensable role within many theological frameworks, not merely as an adversary but as a necessary component of the moral and cosmic order. In Judeo-Christian theology, Satan often appears as the accuser, the tester, or the adversarial prosecutor in the divine court of heaven. That is most clearly illustrated in the book of Job, where Satan is not depicted as the embodiment of ultimate evil, but rather as a challenger permitted by God to test the righteousness of humanity. In this context, Satan operates within divine parameters, fulfilling a function ordained by the Creator himself. Far from being a rogue or autonomous force, Satan is an instrument of divine justice, an agent of discernment who reveals the true nature of human virtue through trial and suffering. This depiction challenges the simplistic binary of good versus evil, suggesting instead a more nuanced and theologically mature framework in which opposition is not inherently sinful but instrumental. If Satan's presence reveals the truth of faith, exposes hypocrisy, and sharpens the contrast between light and darkness, and his existence is not merely tolerated by God but necessitated. The existence of Satan introduced moral tension into the universe, forcing the soul to choose, resist, endure, and mature. Without such tension, there can be no real moral agency, only obedience without substance, virtue without cost, and freedom without gravity. In the broader architecture of divine justice, Satan's role reveals profound implications about God's sovereignty and the very nature of good. If God is omnipotent and omniscient, as traditional theology asserts, then Satan cannot exist outside of God's view. His rebellion, his action, and his continued presence within the universe must, in some mysterious way, serve a divine purpose. This introduces a difficult and often uncomfortable theological dilemma. Why would a benevolent God allow the existence of a being whose work is temptation, accusation, and destruction? One interpretation is that divine justice is not merely retributive, concerned with punishment, but also refining and redemptive. Satan, as the tempter, is the fire in which the metal of the soul is tested and purified. Thus, as a soul must be harmed and heated to become strong, so too must the soul face the hurt of adversity. From this angle, Satan functions less an enemy of God and more as a tool of God's providence, a being who, in his rebellion, paradoxically helps to accomplish the divine will. The paradox lies in the tension between free will and divine orchestration. Satan, exercising free will to rebel, unwittingly becomes part of a larger story in which God draws good even out of evil. In the Christian tradition, this culminates in the crucifixion, the betrayal of Christ, seemingly orchestrated by Satan, becomes the very means of humanity's redemption. Here, Satan's greatest victory is subverted into divine triumph. Such moments reveal that in the economy of divine justice, no evil act can ultimately frustrate God's redemptive purposes, and even the devil's rebellion becomes a brushstroke in the painting of cosmic harmony. From a metaphysical perspective, Satan represents the principle of negation within the dualistic structure of the cosmos, a necessary opposition without which balance, growth, and understanding cannot exist. Many ancient and esoteric traditions hold that creation itself is a tension between opposing forces, light and darkness, order and chaos, spirit and matter, expansion and contraction. In Kabbalistic mysticism, the concept of the Sitra represents this realm of impurity and distortion that exists not in spite of the divine, but as a subtle side of divine emanation. In this schema, Satan is not merely a fallen angel, but a being who operates within the permitted bounds of the divine blueprint. His role is to challenge, obscure, and oppose, thereby enabling the soul to struggle toward clarity, discernment, and light. The Zohar even suggests that it is through confronting the forces of the Sitra that the soul gains merit and elevation. Similarly, in Christian mystical theology, particularly in the writings of theologians such as Origen and Gregory, Satan's existence is interpreted as part of the divine pedagogy, a being whose very opposition sharpens the journey of the soul. The cosmos then is not a battleground between two co-equal forces of good and evil, but a divine theater in which even the adversary plays a vital, though tragic part. Thus, as gravity is necessary for motion and resistance for strength, Satan's opposition is necessary for the full flowering of virtue and freedom. In the absence of the adversary, moral excellence would be meaningless, like a prize won without a race. Finally, the presence of Satan within the vital state raises profound eschatological questions about the end of evil and the possibility of conciliation. Will Satan be destroyed, as the book of Revelation suggests? Can he be redeemed? Is he irrevocably damned? Or is his punishment also part of a larger divine narrative aimed ultimately at cosmic restoration? Some early church fathers, such as Origen, proposed the controversial doctrine of the eventual restoration of all beings, including Satan, into harmony with God. Though later condemned as heresy, the idea forces us to confront the nature of God's mercy. If divine love is truly infinite, can it exclude any creature forever? On the other hand, traditional Christian doctrine emphasized that Satan's rebellion was absolute, informed by full knowledge and irrevocable choice, making repentance impossible. This view casts Satan not merely as a tragic figure, but as a being who embodies the repentant will, the choice of self over God forever. Yet, even this framing affirms Satan's utility within the vital state. His existence becomes a warning, a mirror, a symbol of what it means to reject truth and love. In the end, whether Satan is ultimately annihilated, reconciled, or imprisoned internally, his existence up to that point has served the purpose of demonstrating the full range of moral possibility. Satan shows us the depth of rebellion and, in doing so, illuminates the path of obedience. He is the question to which divine justice is the answer, the problem to which grace is the cure, and the exile whose story gives meaning to the hope of return. Without the dark canvas of his rebellion, the brilliance of divine justice and mercy could never be fully revealed. In conclusion, the question of whether Satan is truly evil cannot be answered with a simplistic binary of good versus bad, for the figure of Satan is a multi-dimensional archetype woven into the theological, psychological, and philosophical and cultural fabric of human consciousness. Across millennia, he has been portrayed as both the adversary and the accuser, the tempter and the tester, the destroyer and the awakener. In Abrahamic traditions, Satan is presented as a fallen angel whose rebellion is both an act of pride and a manifestation of freedom, and yet Paradoxically, his actions often serve divine purposes, exposing false righteousness, testing human faith, and forcing the soul to confront its own wickedness. This paradox reveals the complexity of Satan's role in divine narratives. He is not merely a villain in opposition to God, but a player in the divine drama whose very presence deepens the moral weight of human choice. If God allows Satan to exist and even to act, then his purpose, however destructive, must be accounted for within the framework of divine justice. In this light, Satan is less a figure of pure malice and more a symbol of the necessary tension between obedience and defiance, truth and illusion, faith and doubt. The evil attributed to him may not lie in his existence itself, but in the choices he presents and compels others to make. Moreover, from a psychological and symbolic standpoint, Satan is not merely an external enemy to be defeated, but an internal reality to be understood. As John noted, the confrontation with the shadow, the dark side of our psyche, is essential for achieving spiritual and psychological wholeness. In this context, Satan becomes a mirror of the human soul, reflecting on the desires, fears, instincts, and drives that are suppressed in the name of civility or sanctity. He embodies the rain that shimmers beneath holiness, the lust repressed by shame, the hunger for power masked as humility. To demonize Satan without understanding him is to avoid confronting these realities within ourselves. The journey of integration requires facing this figure not as an alien enemy, but as a part of the self that must be acknowledged, disciplined, and redeemed. Philosophers, too, have long grappled with the moral implication of Satan's story. Is rebellion always wrong, or does it reveal the courage to question another's authority? Is disobedience always sinful, or can it be the seed moral awakening? In works like Paradise Lost, Satan's tragic defiance evokes a strange sympathy, not because his actions are commendable, but because his struggle mirrors the existential plight of humanity. To seek meaning in suffering, identity in alienation, and freedom in a world of constraint. Therefore, Satan transcends the narrow role of tempter and becomes a mythic representation of the soul's confrontation with the mystery of evil and the cost of selfhood. When viewed through the lens of comparative religion and control, Satan's figure becomes even more complex. In some traditions, the God of the Old Testament is seen as a tyrant, while the serpent in Eden, often equated with Satan, is viewed as a liberator of foreign knowledge. In others, like some strands of mysticism and esotericism, Satan or similar entities are portrayed as necessary aspects of the dualistic cosmos, functioning not in opposition to God, but in balance with the right world. In Buddhist cosmology, for instance, the concept of Mara echoes Satan's role as the one who distracts the soul from enlightenment, not through overt evil, but through subtle temptation and illusion. In Hinduism, the dance between order and chaos is internal, with deities and demons both playing the part in the unfolding of Dharma. These views suggest that the adversarial principle personified by Satan may not be uniquely malevolent, but rather than an essential aspect of reality that reflects the tension inherent in growth, transformation, and choice. The fearsome depictions of health, punishment, and destruction associated with Satan across various religions may reflect not so much the nature of Satan himself, but humanity's profound dread of moral failure, spiritual blindness, and separation from truth. In this sense, Satan becomes a scapegoat upon which we cast our fears, but also a dark teacher whose lessons, however painful, drive the soul towards self-realization and repentance. In synthesizing in vast dimensions of Satan's character, what emerges is not a figure of clear-cut evil, but one of profound spiritual significance, whether seen as a fallen angel, an agent of divine justice, a psychological archetype, or a misunderstood force of nature. Satan's role in the moral universe is one of provocation and revelation. He is the question that pierces certainty, the drop that purifies faith, the fire that tests metal, and the darkness that makes the light visible. To say that Satan is truly evil may be to misunderstand the nature of evil itself. True evil may lie not in rebellion, questioning, or desire, but in the refusal to engage with this element honestly and redemptively. Perhaps the greatest evil is not Satan's existence, but the human denial of the evil within, the projection of own blame onto an external adversary, instead of confronting one's own complicity in suffering and corruption. In that sense, Satan's presence is indispensable. He challenges, disturbs, accuses, and tempts, not out of random malice, but in accordance with a mystery that underlies all divine dealings. Whether one sees Satan as damned or necessary, misunderstood or malicious, one truth remains. In wrestling with Satan, we wrestle with ourselves, and only through such confrontation can the soul hope to emerge purified, awakened, and truly free. Thank you for listening and joining me in learning about Is Satan Truly Evil? Please leave your comments, like this video, and share it with others. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more great Bible story. Goodbye and see you in next video.